Date, 15 February 1943. Location, Patricia Lake, Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. The cold cut through Henry Martin's wool coat like a blade. He stood at the edge of Patricia Lake, watching his breath crystallize in the -20 air. Behind him, 15 other men shuffled in the snow, conscientious objectors like himself, pulled from the work camps to build something the Royal Canadian Mounted Police refused to explain. The RCMP officer handed him a saw. "No questions," the man said. "Just cut the ice blocks, move them to the wooden frame, stack them according to the drawings." Henry looked at the frozen lake. The drawings made no sense. They showed a structure 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, rising from a wooden platform built on cleared ice. Refrigeration pipes snaked through the design like copper veins. The building would be covered with a roof, disguised as a boathouse. But why? Why build a building of ice inside a building of wood, on top of a lake already frozen solid? The other men asked the same questions in whispers. Mennonites and Doukhobors, men who refused to kill, now sawing blocks of ice under armed guard. The war seemed very far away in this mountain valley, yet very close in the suspicion that hung in the cold air. They worked in shifts. The ice blocks came from the lake itself, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. Henry's hands cramped around the saw handle, his back burned. The blocks had to be exact, fitted together with wooden framing and layers of tar paper. The refrigeration system arrived in crates marked with British military stamps. 1 horsepower motor, compressor coils, ducts that would pump cold air through the structure. By early March, the first layer was complete. The structure rose slowly from the lake, a strange hybrid of ice and engineering. The tar smelled acrid in the frozen air. The wooden roof went up, hiding their work from the sky. Inside, the temperature never rose above freezing, even when the spring sun began to warm the valley. Nobody told them what they were building. The guards said nothing. The engineers who arrived from Ottawa and Montreal spoke in codes. Henry heard fragments: pykrete, Atlantic Gap, U-boats, aircraft carrier. The words made no sense together. One night, Henry overheard 2 engineers talking. The structure would be a model, they said, 1/50th scale of something much larger, something that would float in the North Atlantic and launch planes against German submarines, something made of ice mixed with wood pulp, something that bullets could not penetrate, an aircraft carrier made of ice. Henry looked at the structure rising from Patricia Lake. It weighed 1,000 tons already. The full-size version would be 600 meters long, over 2 million tons, the largest ship ever built. Unsinkable because it could be repaired with water, impervious to torpedoes because the ice would absorb the blast. It sounded impossible. It sounded insane. Yet here they were, building the prototype under the watching eye of the mountains and the war. By April, the structure was complete. The refrigeration system hummed day and night, keeping the ice frozen as spring arrived. The engineers ran tests. They measured temperatures. They calculated load-bearing capacity. They fired bullets into sample blocks of pykrete made in the laboratory buildings at Lake Louise. The pykrete blocks barely showed the impact. Regular ice shattered. Pykrete held. Churchill wanted this ship, the engineers said. Churchill himself had approved the project. Most secret, the documents read. The Prime Minister believed this floating ice fortress could win the war in the Atlantic. But Henry saw the problems. The refrigeration system struggled to maintain temperature. Some pipes had arrived damaged. Air had to be pumped through the ducts instead of the planned brine coolant. The structure sagged slightly in warmer weather. The engineers frowned at their calculations and adjusted the formulas. One evening in late April, Henry stood outside the boathouse as the sun set behind Pyramid Mountain. The ice lake was beginning to break up around the edges. Inside the building, the prototype remained frozen solid, but the refrigeration motor strained under the load. He thought about the full-size version. The steel required for the refrigeration alone would build a conventional carrier. The wood pulp needed would cripple paper production across Canada. The ship would move at 7 knots, slower than the convoys it was meant to protect. And the construction time, at least a year, maybe 2, in a war where every month mattered. Henry heard footsteps behind him. One of the senior engineers, a man named Bernal, walked to the water's edge. The engineer lit a cigarette and stared at the boathouse. "It's remarkable," Bernal said. 1,000 tons of ice, floating, refrigerated, stable. The concept works. "But?" Henry asked. Bernal exhaled smoke. "But it may not be enough. The war is changing. New aircraft with longer range. Portugal is letting us use airfields in the Azores. The Atlantic gap is closing." He paused. "And Pike has been shut out of the planning. The Americans aren't interested. The costs keep rising." "So we built this for nothing?" "We built this to find out if it could be done," Bernal said. "And now we know. Sometimes knowing is enough, even when the answer is no." The engineer walked back toward the camp buildings. Henry remained by the lake, watching the last light fade from the mountains. Inside the boathouse, the refrigeration motor hummed, keeping 1,000 tons of ice frozen in the spring night, a fragment of a dream that was already beginning to melt. 3,000 miles away in London, the chiefs of staff were reviewing the latest estimates. The costs had doubled, the steel requirements had tripled, and the latest intelligence showed the U-boat threat was diminishing. But the prototype on Patricia Lake remained a frozen mystery in the Canadian Rockies, and the men who built it still did not know what it meant. Date 19 August 1943. Location Combined Operations Headquarters, London. The conference room smelled of cigar smoke and anxious sweat. Lord Louis Mountbatten stood at the head of the table, 2 blocks resting in front of him. One was clear ice. The other looked cloudy, fibrous, strange. The chiefs of staff sat in silence, waiting. This was the moment. Churchill had demanded proof. The Americans were skeptical. The Royal Navy architects had filed reports questioning every aspect of the design. And Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, was consuming every resource the Allies could muster. If Habbakuk was going to survive, Mountbatten needed to show them something impossible. He held up the first block. "Ordinary ice," he said. "Strong in compression, brittle under impact." He drew his service pistol. The admirals leaned back in their chairs. The shot echoed in the confined space. The ice block exploded into fragments. Shards clattered across the table. A few officers brushed ice from their uniforms. Mountbatten picked up the second block. Pykrete, 14% wood pulp, 86% water. Developed by Max Perutz at low-temperature research facilities. Stronger than concrete, slower to melt, and, as you will see, resistant to projectiles. He aimed at the pykrete block. The bullet ricocheted. The sound was different, sharper, more metallic. The round bounced off the block, tore through someone's trouser leg, and buried itself in the wall. Admiral Ernest King looked down at the graze on his leg, then up at Mountbatten, his face frozen between shock and fury. "My apologies, Admiral, but you see the point. This material can withstand direct fire. A hull 40 feet thick would be impervious to torpedoes. We could build a carrier larger than anything afloat, unsinkable, self-repairing, capable of launching heavy bombers from its deck." General Alan Brooke cleared his throat. "We've read the reports from Canada. The prototype proved the concept, but the estimates have changed significantly since December." Mountbatten nodded. "The steel requirements are substantial. The refrigeration system alone requires specialized machinery, and the insulation. The insulation makes the entire proposition absurd. You're proposing to wrap a 2-million-ton block of ice in steel plating and pump refrigerant through miles of ducting. How is that more efficient than building a conventional carrier?" "Because conventional carriers can be sunk. Habbakuk cannot. Even if damaged, you simply patch it with water and let it refreeze. The ship repairs itself." Portal shook his head. "The ship also moves at 7 knots. The convoys move faster. By the time Habbakuk reaches mid-Atlantic, the battle will have moved elsewhere." Brooke tapped his pen on the table. "Lord Mountbatten, the facts have changed. Portugal has granted us access to the Azores. We have bases in Iceland. The new Liberator bombers can patrol the entire Atlantic with auxiliary fuel tanks. The gap your ice ship was meant to fill is closing." "And the U-boats?" Mountbatten asked. "Declining," Brooke said. "Our losses in May dropped significantly. New radar, improved depth charges, better tactics. The wolf packs are retreating. We're winning the Atlantic War with the tools we have." Mountbatten set down his pistol. He'd known this was coming. The reports from Canada had been clear. The prototype on Patricia Lake had shown that pykrete worked, but it had also revealed the scale of the engineering challenge. Cold flow, the way ice deforms under pressure, required massive steel reinforcement. The refrigeration system needed constant power. The construction would take years, not months, and the estimated cost had climbed to £10 million, enough to build several conventional carriers. But the strategic situation killed Habbakuk. The war was moving. D-Day was being planned for spring 1944. Every ton of steel, every engineer, every construction worker was needed for the invasion fleet. There was no room for experimental ice ships, no matter how revolutionary. "What about the Canadians?" someone asked. The National Research Council stopped testing in June. Dr. Mackenzie concluded that full-size construction is impractical. The costs are too high. The wood pulp requirements would devastate Canadian paper production. And the technical difficulties, steering a ship with a 100-foot rudder, maintaining stable refrigeration in salt water, preventing cold flow in 40-foot thick walls, remain unsolved. The room fell silent. Outside, London was preparing for another night of blackout. The war ground on, brutal and exhausting, consuming men and material at a rate that made every decision a calculation of survival. Churchill's memorandum had said, "Most secret. Build the ship immediately. Order more if the first succeeds." The Prime Minister had been enthralled by the audacity of it, the sheer impossible scale. A floating fortress of ice, unsinkable, invincible, the ultimate weapon against the U-boat menace. But the U-boat menace was fading, and Overlord was coming. "Gentlemen," Brooke said, "I believe we have our answer. Project Habbakuk will be suspended pending further review. If strategic conditions change, we can revisit the proposal. But for now, our resources must be directed toward the invasion of Europe." Mountbatten gathered his papers. The pykrete block sat on the table, the bullet impact barely visible on its cloudy surface. In another timeline, perhaps, this material would have changed naval warfare. But in this timeline, in this war, it was a fascinating dead end. After the meeting, Mountbatten walked through the blacked-out streets. He thought about Geoffrey Pike, the eccentric inventor who dreamed up Habbakuk. Pike had been excluded from the project, deemed too difficult to work with. The Americans had refused to participate. The Royal Navy had never believed in it. And now it was over. But the prototype still floated on Patricia Lake. The refrigeration had been shut down in June, but the ice remained, slowly melting through the summer. The conscientious objectors who built it had returned to their work camps, never knowing what they had created. The engineers who designed it had moved on to other projects. Somewhere in the Canadian Rockies, 1,000 tons of ice was turning back to water, carrying with it the dream of an unsinkable ship, a fortress on the ocean, a solution to a problem that no longer existed. Mountbatten stopped at a corner, waiting for the air raid sirens. They didn't come. The night was quiet. The war continued, fought with conventional weapons, conventional ships, conventional courage. Sometimes the impossible remains impossible, even when you can prove it works. Date, 12 September 1984. Location, Patricia Lake, Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. Susan Langley descended through the dark water, her dive light cutting a narrow beam through the murk. 40 feet down, 50. The temperature dropped with each meter. Her breath created bubbles that rose toward the distant surface, silver spheres climbing through green shadows. She'd heard the stories for 2 years. An airplane made of ice, a secret experiment, something impossible at the bottom of Patricia Lake. Local divers spoke about it in taverns, mixing fact and legend until the truth disappeared beneath myth. Most people assumed it was nonsense. But Susan was an underwater archaeologist. She didn't dismiss stories, she investigated them. 60 feet down, her light found the bottom, silt and darkness. She swept the beam across the lake bed, looking for anything unusual. The search area was large. The stories had been vague about location. South Shore, they said. Western End, near where the old boathouse used to stand. Her light caught something angular, not natural. She swam closer. Metal piping, hundreds of feet of it scattered across the bottom like the ribs of some mechanical creature. Copper tubes, oxidized green. Steel ducts rusted and collapsed. She followed the pattern, mapping the debris field in her mind. The piping formed a rectangle, 60 feet by 30 feet, exactly what the stories had described, though nobody had mentioned piping. She found the wooden framing next, massive timbers, waterlogged and encrusted with algae. They lay in organized rows, the skeleton of some strange structure. Between the timbers, she found layers of tar paper, black and disintegrating. This was no airplane. This was something else entirely. Susan surfaced, planned another dive. She returned with a camera. Over the next 3 years, she would make dozens of dives, funded by archaeological grants, slowly piecing together what lay beneath Patricia Lake. The evidence told a story. A wooden platform built on the frozen lake ice in early 1943. A refrigeration system with compressor coils and air ducts. A structure covered with tar paper and topped with a roof. Something massive, engineered, deliberate. And all of it surrounding what must have been, 40 years ago, a block of ice weighing 1,000 tons. Susan found documents in the National Research Council archives. Classified reports, now declassified. Project Habbakuk. The name was misspelled in the original documents, missing a K. A plan to build an aircraft carrier from pykrete, a mixture of wood pulp and ice. The prototype had been built here at Patricia Lake by conscientious objectors who never knew what they were building. The reports described the tests, temperature measurements, load-bearing calculations, bullet resistance experiments. The prototype had worked technically. The pykrete had proven stable. The refrigeration had kept the structure frozen through 3 hot Canadian summers before the machinery was finally removed. But the full-size ship had never been built. The costs were too high, the technical problems too numerous. The the strategic need had evaporated as the war turned in the Allies' favor. In December 1943, the final board meeting concluded that Habbakuk was impractical. The enormous production resources required could not be justified. The prototype had been abandoned. The roof had been left in place, disguising the structure as a boathouse, as even the ice slowly melted. Local residents had known something secret was happening, but the true nature of the project remained classified for decades. By 1944, the ice had melted completely. The structure had subsided into the lake, taking with it the physical evidence of one of the strangest military experiments of the war. Susan descended again in the summer of 1987. This time, she brought a full survey team. They mapped every piece of piping, every timber, every fragment of the refrigeration system. The data painted a picture of desperate innovation, of engineers and scientists pushing the boundaries of what was possible. She thought about the men who built this, conscientious objectors, many of them Mennonites, sawing ice blocks in -20 weather. They had refused to kill, yet they had contributed to the war effort in ways they never understood. One of them, Henry Martins, had described receiving burns from hot tar. He'd been puzzled by the work at the time. Only after the war did he learn what they had built. By the time he found out, Martin said, he was proud of his contribution. Project Habbakuk had been an attempt to save lives by ending the U-boat war. It had failed, but the intention had been defensive, not offensive. A floating airfield to protect merchant convoys. A shield, not a sword. Susan surfaced for the last time that summer. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting Pyramid Mountain gold and red. The lake was quiet. Tourists paddled canoes near the shore, unaware of what lay beneath them. In 1988, the Alberta Underwater Archaeology Society installed a commemorative plaque on the lake bottom. It marked the site of the Habbakuk prototype, describing it as one of the most unusual wartime experiments ever conducted in Canada. Susan sat on the shore, writing her final report. The wreckage told a story about the nature of war and innovation, about brilliant ideas that failed because the world changed faster than they could be realized, about the gap between theory and practice, between laboratory success and operational reality. Habbakuk was possible. The prototype proved that. Pykrete worked. Ice could be engineered, reinforced, refrigerated. An aircraft carrier made of frozen wood pulp could float and remain stable. But possible and practical were different things. The war needed practical solutions, not revolutionary experiments. It needed the ships and planes and weapons that could be built quickly, tested quickly, deployed quickly. Habbakuk required too much time, too much steel, too many machinery, too many uncertainties. So it had been abandoned, and the prototype had melted into Patricia Lake, and the dream of an ice ship had dissolved like the material it was made from. Susan packed her equipment. The lake reflected the darkening sky. Somewhere beneath the surface, the piping and timbers marked the grave of an idea that had almost been real, a ship that had almost been built, a solution to a problem that solved itself through other means. The war had ended 40 years ago. The men who conceived Habbakuk were dead or dying. The engineers had moved on to other projects. The conscientious objectors had lived quiet lives, their contribution to history known only to themselves and to divers like Susan, who descended into dark water looking for fragments of impossible things. Patricia Lake was peaceful now. The mountains stood eternal above it. The war was memory. The ice ship was legend. But the wreckage remained, 50 feet down, cold and dark and permanent, waiting for anyone curious enough to look for it. A reminder that human ingenuity is limitless, but human resources are not. That desperation breeds innovation, but innovation does not always breed victory. That some ships sail only in dreams, And some ice melts even when you try to keep it frozen. And some projects die, not because they failed, but because the world moved on without them. The underwater plaque read, Project Habbakuk, 1943, the ship that never sailed. But Susan knew better. The ship had sailed in a way. It had sailed through the imaginations of brilliant people who believed they could build the impossible. It had sailed through months of hard work by men who had no idea what they were creating. It had sailed through classified reports and secret meetings and desperate calculations. It just hadn't sailed on water. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the attempt itself mattered. The willingness to imagine something so audacious that even failure would teach something valuable. Susan walked back to her vehicle. Behind her, Patricia Lake returned to its evening calm, holding its secret in the depths, 1,000 tons of history dissolving slowly into silt and legend, while above, the mountains stood watch over mysteries that would never be fully solved.